When Queen Mary's youngest son died, she said something that sounds heartless, that his death was a relief. Most videos treat this as scandal, but unless you've lived with someone who has uncontrollable epilepsy, you probably shouldn't judge. And that's not me being sentimental. That's me asking you to wait. Wait until you know what refractory epilepsy actually does to a 13-year-old body. Wait until you've heard the full quote, not the single word that gets ripped out and waved around like a gotcha. Wait until you understand what Queen Mary was actually watching every single day for nearly a decade. Because here's what most royal content won't tell you. They haven't read the diary entry. They haven't read the letter. They grabbed one word, slapped it on a thumbnail, and called it history. So let's do this properly. But first, a quick word on the woman herself, because understanding who Mary was before she became queen consort changes everything about how you read what came later. She was born Princess Victoria Mary of Teck in 1867. Everyone called her May, and the way she entered the inner circle of the British monarchy tells you more about her character than any biography summary ever could. In 1891, she was engaged to Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, eldest son of the Prince of Wales, second in line to the throne. The match was arranged. May was considered suitable, royal enough by blood, sensible by temperament, and, critically, unlikely to cause problems. She accepted the role. Duty. That word again. Then, Albert Victor died of pneumonia in January 1892. He was 28 years old. And what happened next is the part that makes modern audiences wince. Because within 18 months, May was redirected. There really is no kinder word for it. Toward Albert Victor's younger brother, George. Same family, same obligation. Different man. Queen Victoria herself approved the arrangement. May accepted again. Not because she was passive, not because she lacked feeling, because she understood, with a clarity that bordered on ruthlessness, that her role was bigger than her preferences. She and George married in July 1893, and the marriage that began as a dynastic transaction slowly, quietly, became something real. George V would later tell friends that Mary was the only person in the world with whom he could fully be himself. His letters to her when duty separated them were affectionate. Hers back were sometimes playful, a tone that jars completely with the Ice Queen caricature. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because before we get to the woman Mary became, we need to talk about the son who broke her heart in a way no one ever talks about honestly. Prince John Charles Francis was born July 12, 1905, the sixth and youngest child of the Prince and Princess of Wales, who'd become King George V and Queen Mary 5 years later. For his first 4 years, nothing was wrong. He played with his 5 siblings at Sandringham and York Cottage. He showed up in family photographs dressed identically to his brothers, looking out at the camera with the same wide face and steady gaze as his mother. Staff described him as affectionate, sweet-natured, given to bursts of laughter that charmed everyone around him. Then, around 1909, the seizures started. At first, they were infrequent enough to raise concern without panic, but by the time John was 6 or 7, they were getting worse, more severe, more frequent, and the royal physicians were privately telling his parents the condition was unlikely to improve, which, in 1909, was essentially a death sentence delivered in polite language. Because here's what epilepsy treatment looked like in the early 20th century. It looked like almost nothing. The primary drug available was potassium bromide, a Victorian-era sedative that could sometimes reduce seizure frequency, but came with devastating side effects: chronic drowsiness, cognitive dulling, skin rashes so severe they could become disfiguring, persistent gastrointestinal distress. Phenobarbital, the first genuinely effective anticonvulsant, didn't enter clinical practice until 1912, and even then its use was experimental, its dosing imprecise. The drugs that have transformed epilepsy management today, carbamazepine, valproate, the dozens of modern options, wouldn't exist for another 50 years. There was no MRI to image John's brain, no EEG to map his seizure activity. Hans Berger wouldn't publish the first human electroencephalogram until 1929. What John had, in modern clinical terms, was refractory epilepsy. And that word, refractory, is precise. It means the seizures don't respond to treatment. Even today, with everything 21st century neurology can throw at it, refractory epilepsy affects roughly 30% of patients and remains one of the hardest conditions in medicine to manage. In 1910, with bromides as essentially the only option, the odds of controlling John's seizures were almost non-existent. So let me paint the picture that most royal documentaries skip past. This wasn't a child who had occasional episodes and otherwise lived a normal life. Seizures were the defining feature of John's existence, unpredictable, violent, and every single one carried a specific danger that his caregivers lived in terror of. Status epilepticus. That's a seizure that doesn't stop on its own, or a series of seizures hitting so fast the person never regains consciousness between them. Today, it's a medical emergency requiring intravenous drugs administered under clinical supervision. In 1910, there was no intervention. A child in status epilepticus could seize for 30 minutes, an hour, longer, while the adults around him did nothing, could do nothing, except try to prevent physical injury and wait. Prolonged seizures starve the brain of oxygen. They cause neurological damage. They kill. Every seizure John had carried that risk. Every single one. His nanny, Charlotte "La La" Bill, who'd raised several of the older children and who doted on John in particular, knew this. She lived with this knowledge day after day, year after year. And on top of the epilepsy, there's strong evidence John also exhibited developmental differences that modern clinicians would likely place on the autism spectrum. The Lancet Neurology described it as an autism-like learning disorder. The combination of uncontrollable seizures and developmental delay in the child of a reigning monarch created a problem that was as much social as medical. Because the stigma around epilepsy in Edwardian Britain was staggering, it wasn't understood as a neurological disorder. It was grouped with mental deficiency, associated with hereditary weakness, madness, moral degeneracy. The 1890 Lunacy Act effectively classified epileptic individuals alongside the insane. Specialized epileptic colonies existed across England to segregate sufferers from the general population. For a royal family whose legitimacy rested partly on the perceived fitness of the bloodline, having a visibly epileptic child wasn't just a private grief. It was a political vulnerability during a period of rising Republican sentiment. So around 1916, as the Great War raged and John's seizures intensified beyond what could be safely managed within the chaos and formality of the main royal household, a decision was made. John would live at Wood Farm, a smaller property on the Sandringham estate, under Lala Bill's full-time care. Now, and this is where I need you to hold two things in your head at once. Yes, this separated him from the primary household. Yes, he was gradually withdrawn from public appearances and official photographs. The word that gets used in every retelling is hidden, and elements of concealment were absolutely at work. But the fuller picture is less damning than that single word implies. The noise, rigid scheduling, and unpredictable social demands of royal life would have been overwhelming for a child with John's conditions. At Wood Farm, he had space, quiet, routine, the garden he loved, animals, the undivided attention of the woman who'd become, in every practical sense, his primary parent. His siblings visited, his mother visited. Queen Mary's private letters reference John with consistent tenderness, poor little Johnny, and express ongoing concern about his condition. He wasn't abandoned, he was accommodated, in the way that made sense given what anyone understood about his illness, and given the essentially non-existent treatment options. Was it also convenient for the family's public image? Undeniably. But collapsing the entire decision into cynical image management requires ignoring the medical reality and the evidence of continued family contact. Then came January 18th, 1919. At 5:30 in the evening, a telephone rang at Sandringham House. Lala Bill, calling from Wood Farm, delivered news that was both devastating and, in a way only those who've lived through prolonged illness can comprehend, expected. Prince John had suffered a severe seizure. He'd died. He was 13 years old. That night, Queen Mary wrote in her diary. Here's what she actually said. Not the excerpt, not the single word, but the passage. At 5:30, Lala Bill telephoned me from Wood Farm, Wolferton, that our poor darling little Johnny had passed away suddenly after one of his seizures. The first break in the family circle is hard to bear, but people who understood realized that it was a great relief, as his malady was becoming worse as he grew older, and he has thus been spared much suffering. I broke the news to George, and we motored down to Wood Farm, found poor Lala very calm and resigned. Our poor darling little Johnny. The first break in the family circle is hard to bear. Those are the words that get left on the cutting room floor. Every time. She wrote separately to her close friend Emily Allendale, and the full weight of her feeling is even clearer there. For him, it is a great release. I cannot say how grateful we feel to God for having taken him in such a peaceful way. He just slept quietly into his heavenly home. No pain, no struggle. Just peace for the poor little troubled spirit, which had been a great anxiety to us for many years, ever since he was 4 years old. Poor little troubled spirit. That's not a cold woman. That's a mother who watched her son convulse, lose consciousness, injure himself in falls, and wake confused and frightened, over and over and over, for 9 years. And when the end came gently, in sleep, without pain, she was grateful for the gentleness. George V wrote in his own diary that day. He called John's death the greatest mercy possible. Queen Alexandra, the Dowager Queen, wrote with equal compassion. The entire family expressed relief, because relief is what happens when suffering ends. Modern palliative care literature has a term for this: caregiver relief. It's normal. It's healthy. It's entirely compatible with deep love. It doesn't mean you wanted the death. It means you didn't want the suffering. And when the suffering stopped, something unclenched inside you. Pulling one word from a mother's grief to prove she was heartless isn't analysis. It's laziness. Which brings us to the second charge, and this one's darker. Some versions of Queen Mary's story go further than cold motherhood. They go all the way to blood. The accusation that Mary had blood on her hands for the murder of the Romanoffs. Tsar Nicholas II, Tsarina Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria Anastasia, and 13-year-old Alexei, executed by Bolshevik forces in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg on July 17, 1918. The British government had been offered the chance to save them. It withdrew the offer. Here's what actually happened. In March 1917, Nicholas abdicated following the February Revolution. The Russian provisional government wanted the Romanoffs out of the country. The British government, under Prime Minister David Lloyd George, made an initial offer of asylum. George V, Nicholas's first cousin, their mothers were sisters, appeared willing at first. Then he panicked. His private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, sent a series of increasingly urgent letters to the Foreign Office expressing the king's fear that hosting the deposed Tsar would inflame anti-monarchist sentiment in Britain. And honestly, the fear wasn't irrational. Britain in 1917 was buckling under the weight of the war, catastrophic casualties on the Western Front, escalating industrial unrest, and the Russian Revolution electrifying socialist and republican movements across Europe. George V had already changed the royal family's surname from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor that July, specifically to distance the crown from its German roots. Taking in Nicholas, a global symbol of autocratic excess overthrown by his own people, would have been political dynamite. By April 1917, the asylum offer was effectively dead. For decades afterward, Lloyd George took the public blame. Buckingham Palace didn't correct the record. It wasn't until Kenneth Rose published his landmark George V biography in 1983, drawing on previously restricted documents including Stamfordham's letters, that the historical consensus shifted to where it now firmly sits. George V, acting through Stamfordham, killed the asylum offer. Lloyd George had been willing. The king was not. So where does Mary fit into this? She doesn't. The Queen Consort of the United Kingdom in 1917 held no constitutional role in foreign policy. She had no seat in cabinet. She didn't direct the Foreign Office. No correspondence between Mary and Stamfordham about the asylum question has surfaced in the royal archives, and historians have looked extensively over the past century. Her diary entries from this period show a woman who was aware of the crisis and horrified by its outcome, but who was operating within a system that deliberately excluded the consort from political decision-making. The accusation requires holding a woman responsible for a decision she had no legal authority to make, no documented role in shaping, and no power to override. Ask the only question that matters when assigning blame. Who had the power? Every serious historical account gives the same answer, and that answer specifically excludes the Queen Consort. Proximity to a king doesn't make you complicit in his decisions. Sharing a breakfast table doesn't make you co-author of policy. Now, let's talk about who Mary actually was, because if we stop at she wasn't cold and she wasn't guilty, we've only cleared the charges. We haven't met the person. James Pope Hennessy, who wrote her authorized biography in 1959 with access to her private papers, describes someone who shatters the caricature. Sharp wit, genuine warmth toward people she trusted, considerable intelligence, and a near-photographic memory for detail. She could recall specifics of conversations from decades earlier and expected the same precision from others. She was deeply knowledgeable about art, decorative arts, and history, not as a dilettante's hobby, but as a genuine intellectual passion developed through years of study. And then there's the collecting, because you can't talk about Queen Mary without mentioning the collecting, and it would be dishonest to pretend it doesn't complicate the portrait. She was an aggressive, sometimes breathtakingly bold acquirer of antiques, objets d'art, and decorative pieces. The polite version. She would admire an object during a visit to someone's home, and the owner would feel socially compelled to offer it as a gift. The less polite version? She was not above engineering exactly these situations, and she knew perfectly well what she was doing. There are accounts of hosts hiding their best pieces before Mary came to call, which is either hilarious or appalling, depending on your tolerance for royal eccentricity. I lean toward hilarious, personally. But here's the thing. The collecting habit has been inflated through decades of repetition and amusement into a defining trait, when it was really a footnote. An odd footnote, sure. A footnote that makes you raise an eyebrow, but a footnote nonetheless, attached to a woman whose actual defining qualities, intelligence, discipline, emotional fortitude under pressures that would have cracked most people, barely get mentioned in the same breath. The world remembers the sticky-fingered queen and forgets the sharp-minded one. That imbalance tells you more about how we consume royal stories than it tells you about Mary. Then came December 1936, and the blow that, by all accounts, wounded her more deeply than almost anything else. Her eldest son, Edward VIII, and I'm going to say this once, clearly, because getting it wrong is the kind of mistake that makes an audience stop trusting you. Edward VIII, not the 7th. Edward VII was his grandfather, Queen Victoria's son, abdicated the throne on December 11, 1936, to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. Mary was devastated. Not romantically devastated, not sentimentally devastated. Devastated in the way that only a woman who had structured her entire existence around the concept of duty could be. She had been redirected from one dead prince to another in 1892 and accepted it without public complaint because duty demanded it. She had watched her youngest son deteriorate and die because the world they lived in offered no alternative, and she bore it because that was what was required. She had spent decades suppressing her natural shyness behind a mask of regal composure because the crown demanded a certain performance, and she delivered it every single day. And then her son, the king, threw it all away for a woman. She reportedly told him it was inconceivable that any member of the royal family could put personal feelings above duty. She wrote to him directly after the abdication, and the letter, while its full text remains in the royal archives, is described by those who've seen it as containing a fury so controlled it practically vibrates off the page. She never forgave it. Not really. Not him, and certainly not Wallis Simpson, whom Mary regarded with a coldness that went beyond disapproval into something closer to contempt. When people cite Mary's iciness, the abdication is usually the moment they point to. But what they're actually seeing isn't a lack of feeling. It's the opposite. It's feeling so intense and so fundamentally violated by her son's choice that the only response she could manage was to freeze. Her second son, the stammering, unprepared Bertie, became George VI, a man who never wanted the crown, thrust onto the throne by his brother's selfishness. Mary watched that too. Watched another son bear the weight that should never have been his. And George VI's eldest daughter, a girl who was 10 years old when her uncle abdicated and her quiet father suddenly became king? Elizabeth. Here's where I want you to look at the screen. Really look. If the editor's done their job, you're seeing Queen Mary in her later years. Those photographs from the 1940s and early 1950s, placed beside her granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II. The resemblance is so striking it's almost disorienting. The same bone structure, the same set of the jaw, the same posture, upright, contained, watchful. That expression they both carried in public, not cold but composed, not distant but disciplined. Elizabeth was Mary's paternal granddaughter, and the genetic echo is unmistakable. They don't just look alike, they carry themselves alike. During the Second World War, Mary, evacuated to Badminton House in Gloucestershire as a guest of her niece, the Duchess of Beaufort, was in her mid-70s. Far from retreating into frail gentility, she threw herself into what she called wooding, organizing teams of soldiers and estate workers to clear undergrowth, remove ivy, harvest salvage materials for the war effort. She worked in most weather. She directed operations with the same commanding clarity she brought to everything. 75 years old, out in the mud, doing her bit. Because that's what duty looked like to her. Not a word, a way of being. That sense of duty that defined Elizabeth II's 70-year reign? Mary was the blueprint, the template, the living example a young princess watched and absorbed long before she ever imagined she'd need it. And that template wasn't built from coldness. It was built from a woman who'd been engaged to one prince and handed to another at 25, who'd borne 6 children and lost the youngest to a disease no one could treat, who had no power over the political decisions history would blame her for, who watched one son abandon the throne and another buckle under its weight, who collected beautiful things, maybe too enthusiastically, and remembered every conversation she'd ever had, and was shy in crowds but razor-sharp in private, and never once, in 60 years of public life, let anyone see her crack. The woman the world remembers as the greatest queen of the 20th century learned what queenship looked like by watching her grandmother. And that grandmother, the one history decided was cold, was heartless, had blood on her hands, was a shy woman with a sharp mind who loved a son she couldn't save, who bore no responsibility for the decisions people blame her for, and who built the template for the monarch the entire world would eventually admire. Most people don't know that. Now you do. Subscribe for more stories like this.